At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mizpah, watching black clouds of flak explode across the sky over Budapest. 24 years old, 17 combat missions, zero margin for error. The Luftwaffe had positioned more than 288mm flak guns around the railway yards below, and they were all firing. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sturparone, Italy. The mission was simple on paper: strike the Shell oil refinery and railway yards in the heart of German-controlled Budapest, cut the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, get home. But by July of 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force knew the statistics. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, 8 would not return home. Some would die. Some would be captured. Some would simply disappear. The formation pressed forward through the curtain of flak. Shells burst in black puffs that could shred aluminum like paper. Mizpah took hits in the tail section, then the wings. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage, but the bomber stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew held their positions. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt sat in the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft: radio operators, gunners, the flight engineer. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of high explosive dropped toward the railway yards below. The B-17 lurched upward as the weight fell away. Then an 88mm shell hit the nose of the aircraft. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire front section of Mizpah vaporized. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels. Everything forward of the cockpit simply ceased to exist. Dudley died instantly. Henderson died instantly. The blast wave tore through what remained of the aircraft. The metal structure that had housed 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. The center of gravity shifted backward. With no weight in the nose, Mizpah pitched up into a near-vertical climb. The bomber began to stall. Swanson could see sky where instruments should have been. Cold air at 30,000 feet screamed through the open cavity. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Wind tore at his flight suit. Blood from the explosion covered the flight deck. Through the gap where the nose had been, Swanson could see the formation continuing toward the rally point. There was no control column. The yoke that connected to the flight control system had been mounted to the forward structure. That structure no longer existed. There were no instruments. The panel had been attached to the nose section. That was gone too. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no way to know what the aircraft was doing except by feel and by looking at the horizon through the massive hole in front of him. But the control cables were still there. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They were exposed now, hanging in the wind, but they were intact. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He did not know how. There was nothing to push, nothing to pull, but somehow he got the aircraft level. Somehow he got it back into loose formation with the group. The bomber should have been unflyable. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with inherent stability, but no engineer had planned for this. No manual covered flying without a cockpit. The only thing keeping Mizpah in the air was physics and desperation. If you want to see how Swanson's crew pulled those bare cables to stay airborne, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Swanson. Behind him, the surviving crew members began moving forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay. They could see the wind tearing through the aircraft. They understood what had to happen next. Over 200 flak guns were still firing. The formation was still over enemy territory, and another shell was about to hit engine number 2. The second 88mm shell struck engine number 2 at 9:44 a.m. The right cyclone radial engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed back along the inboard nacelle on the left wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then seized. Engine number 2 was dead. Mizpah now had 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber began losing airspeed. The formation was pulling ahead. Without the cockpit instruments, Swanson had no way to measure how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Graminzi, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret position. He could see the problem immediately. The control cables ran through the fuselage in bundles: elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables. They were steel wire rope, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Normally, they were enclosed in pulleys and fair leads, hidden behind panels and structure. Now they were completely exposed. The wind was pulling at them. Without someone physically holding the cable steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Simonelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay, where the main cable runs were visible. There was no discussion, no debate. The situation was obvious. Someone had to hold these cables. Someone had to pull them when Swanson needed control input. The problem was coordination. Swanson was sitting in what remained of the cockpit, 40 feet forward. The crew was standing in the bomb bay area. The intercom system was damaged. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried moving the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally actuated were now being buffeted by 300-mile-per-hour wind. He tried the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was something. But without control over the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation and into a dive. Or worse, it would pitch up again, stall, and spin. Either way, everyone would die. The crew began pulling. They wrapped sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel was cold. It cut into their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mizpah's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, the nose came up. Release, it dropped. The problem was that every input had to be perfectly timed. Too much pressure, and the aircraft would over-respond. Too little, and nothing would happen. And they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without instruments or indicators. Mizpah continued falling behind the formation. The other B-17s were maintaining their cruise speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower now. The drag from the missing nose section was enormous. The destroyed engine meant less power, and the formation was not waiting. They could not wait. Every minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and flak. The standard procedure was clear. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mizpah was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles. Swanson could see them in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His own aircraft was losing altitude. Not quickly, but steadily. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000, then 28. The crew kept pulling cables. Their hands were cramping. The cold was brutal. Blood circulation was being cut off by the pressure of the steel against their palms. But they kept pulling. The fuel situation was unknown. The gauges were gone with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He had no idea how long 3 engines could keep them airborne. He had no idea if they were even heading in the right direction. Navigation required instruments. It required a map. It required the navigator, who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Get to the Adriatic. Get to Italy. Get home. Then the crew in the bomb bay started waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson could not turn around to look. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot seat, he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in position, watching the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear section. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail section was the most isolated spot on a B-17, a small compartment at the very back of the fuselage, accessible only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the impact. He had felt the aircraft pitch up violently. He had felt it stabilize. But now he was feeling something else. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework that held the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it should not move. The explosion had created stress fractures somewhere in the fuselage. Or shrapnel had weakened critical support members. Either way, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin. The aircraft would tumble end over end until it disintegrated or hit the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood this. They could see the tail gunner's position through the fuselage. They could see the structure moving, and they had no way to fix it. Mizpah was now at 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was deafening. The cold was penetrating every layer of his flight suit. His hands on the throttles were going numb. But the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the only thing he could adjust without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control column was gone too. His instruments were gone. But he was watching the wings, watching the engines, watching for fighters. German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target. No defensive firepower from neighboring aircraft, no mutual support. Just one crippled bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. But so far, no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had not spotted Mizpah yet. The crew kept pulling cables. Their coordination was improving. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to yaw right. The crew compensated by pulling left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. It was not flying. It was collective survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mizpah crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson did not know this. He had no map, no landmarks he could identify through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be. But the flak stopped. The black clouds of explosions ceased. That meant they were out of the heaviest defensive zones. That meant they might have a chance. A small chance. A chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together. How long the crew could keep pulling cables. How long 3 engines could generate enough thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks were not empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know. B-17s carried 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks. At cruise power, 4 engines burned roughly 200 gallons per hour. But they were not at cruise power. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, trying to maintain altitude and airspeed. That meant fuel consumption was higher. Much higher. Swanson made a decision. The decision was simple. Get the crew out. The aircraft was dying. The tail structure was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over occupied territory. Every minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure. If Mizpah broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured. They would spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required coordination. The standard procedure involved specific exit points. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and others used the waistgun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret to a specific position before climbing out. Each crew member had practiced this dozens of times in training, but training assumed the aircraft was intact. Training assumed the pilot could communicate over the intercom. Training assumed there was time to organize an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of those things. He had no intercom. He had no way to give the order. He had no way to coordinate who went first and who went last. And he could not leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-17 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds. Everyone still aboard would die. At 9:52 a.m., Mizpah was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles. His feet were on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals did nothing without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Burnt sat motionless in the co-pilot seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, watching for any sign of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The wind noise made conversation impossible anyway. The crew in the bomb bay made the decision themselves. They could feel the tail structure flexing. They could see the stress cracks spreading through the fuselage skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft came apart. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness, positioned himself at the window opening, and jumped. The slipstream took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next, then Staff Sergeant George Simonelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank Grimenzi. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less precise inputs. The B-17 began wallowing. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to compensate, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling cables. But the crew was abandoning ship. They had to. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He squeezed through the narrow passage, emerged in the waist gun area, and saw the empty positions where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the exposed control cables, now slack without hands holding them. He saw the massive opening where the nose used to be, 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours. But 5 men would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard Mizpah. Swanson in the pilot seat, Burnt in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, waist gunner, went through the window opening. His parachute deployed cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard: Swanson, Burnt, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable. With almost no one pulling the control cables, Mizpah was responding only to engine power and inherent aerodynamic stability. That stability was designed for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section, not for flight with a failing tail structure. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. 2 men in the remains of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber was still descending. 3 engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It was barely staying in the air through a combination of residual stability and the fact that the wings were still generating lift. Without crew members pulling cables, any significant control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Burnt. No words were exchanged. The wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Burnt needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls. He had no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to deploy a parachute and survive the landing. Burnt unbuckled his harness. He stood up from the co-pilot seat. He moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck, where he could access the main fuselage and reach the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot was still locked in position, hands on throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Burnt climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone. 1 man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at approximately 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady descent. The three remaining engines were producing enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic profile was destroyed. The B-17 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engine sound gave no indication. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely exhausted, at which point they simply stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. And if all three engines quit simultaneously, Mizpah would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated his position. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less. That meant they had covered roughly 40 miles, maybe 45. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was approximately 30 miles from Budapest. That meant they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching the mountains, possibly approaching the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guesswork. Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying blind. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every minute at the controls meant the crew below had more time to distance themselves from the crash site. German patrols would search for a downed bomber. But if Swanson could keep Mizpah flying for another few minutes, the crew members under parachutes would land miles away from where the aircraft eventually hit the ground. That separation could mean the difference between capture and evasion, between imprisonment and freedom. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could break apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump. All while the B-17 was uncontrolled. All while it was potentially entering a death spiral. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. That would give the crew more separation distance. That would give them a better chance. Then he would go. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles. The 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady roar. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right wing, engine number 4 on the far right wing. All running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 a.m. exactly, Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure trying to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be. He pushed back against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. Without anyone controlling the throttles, without anyone making corrections, Mizpah started a gentle left roll. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He squeezed through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay. Nobody was pulling them now. Nobody was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before the G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor was vibrating under his boots. The wind noise was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was diving now. Not vertically, but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical wall. The wind spun him sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then silence. Relative silence. The roar of the engines faded as Mizpah continued its dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall. The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear fuselage was flexing like a reed in the wind. At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched nose down almost vertically. It fell for another 8 seconds, then disappeared into a line of trees 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later. The fuel tanks had ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted southwest with the prevailing wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape showed scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation forces. Somewhere down there were his crew members, who had jumped minutes before him. Somewhere down there was the reality that his war was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson could see trees. He tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy was not designed for precision maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the foliage and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches, 15 feet above the ground. Blood was running down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep lacerations covered his left thigh, where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it, could not put weight on it, could not climb down from the tree. He hung there, suspended in the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious. Below him he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes descending. They had heard the crash of the B-17. Now they were collecting American aircrew. Swanson hung motionless in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson did not respond. The soldiers began discussing how to get him down. They found a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbed up and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson carefully, trying not to worsen the leg injury. When they reached the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived. He examined the broken leg, the lacerations, the blood loss. He applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. He injected morphine from a medical kit. The pain began to fade. Swanson felt the drug taking effect, dulling the sharp agony in his leg to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep cuts with bandages. He checked for other injuries. Ribs seemed intact, no head trauma, no internal bleeding that he could detect. The primary concern was the leg. Without proper treatment, infection would set in. Without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. But for now, the medic had done what he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post. From there, he was moved to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture, and set the bone properly. The procedure was painful despite the morphine. Swanson passed out twice during the process. When he regained consciousness, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The doctor explained through an interpreter that the fracture was clean. The bone would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mizpah's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None had evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan resistance groups operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt, Gramenzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish. All alive. All uninjured except for minor cuts and bruises. All now prisoners of war. They were transported to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, a facility specifically designated for captured Allied aircrew. The camp housed approximately 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh, but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. The barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was minimal. But the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for officer prisoners. There were no mass executions, no systematic torture, just confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. The cast came off in September of 1944. Physical therapy was basic. He walked around the camp perimeter every day, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk without assistance. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered. But the war continued. The camp remained locked. Guards patrolled the wire. Escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mizpah settled into the routine of captivity. They talked about the mission, about the 88mm shell, about the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, about pulling the control cables by hand, about watching their bomber fall into the Yugoslav forest, about Dudley and Henderson, who died instantly when the nose exploded, about how close they all came to dying that day. And they waited. Waited for the war to end. Waited for liberation. Waited to go home. Winter turned to spring. The Germans began evacuating camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions deteriorated. Food became scarce. Some men died during the forced marches. Others escaped in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They marched through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. And on April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past. Soldiers distributed food, water, and cigarettes. Medical personnel checked for injuries and disease. The former prisoners were transported to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The crew of Mizpah went home. All 8 survivors. All 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. All 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Ewald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would say only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted over the following years, eventually retiring as lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not for a single mission, but for a career of service. But that single mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit. The 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. They gathered every few years to remember the war, the missions, the men who did not return. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had survived something that should not have been survivable. They had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and bare control cables exposed to 300-mile-per-hour wind. They had done it through coordination, through determination, through the simple refusal to give up. And they had honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, stayed in Michigan near Swanson. They remained friends until the end. Frank Remenzi returned to his family and rarely discussed the war. George Simonelli kept photographs from the mission. He showed them to his grandchildren decades later, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber fell apart around you. The others scattered across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He had lived a full life. He had seen the world change. He had seen aircraft evolve from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mizpah. The B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest. The bomber that flew on borrowed time and crew determination. The aircraft that proved human will could overcome engineering limits. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Ewald Swanson and the crew of Mizpah don't disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward. For 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, for decades afterward in Michigan and across America. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.